Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving deep into a question that's sparked debate for centuries, really, stirring up everything from wild claims to deeply personal conviction. What are the true aims or purposes of Freemasonry?
It's a fundamental question, isn't it? One that outsiders speculate on constantly.
Yeah.
And, well, even people within the craft have pondered over time.
And our mission in this deep dive is to explore that question, not by trying to, settle all the debates, but by looking specifically through the lens of one fascinating historical document.
Right.
It's an article from the Builder magazine published way back in May of 1930 titled The Objects of Masonry.
That's right. This article offers a perspective from a specific time and place, reacting to different ideas circulating then. It's our primary source material today, and we're sticking strictly to what this author, writing in 1930, tells us.
Just what's in this document.
Exactly. About the perceived objects and historical intent.
And the article itself immediately sets the stage by acknowledging those really extreme external views. You sometimes hear things like claims that Masonry's aim is the destruction of religion, overturning government, leading to anarchy, even accusations related to, well, the triumph of hell.
Yeah, pretty intense stuff. But the author quickly labels these as assertions from our friends the enemy, basically, and moves on.
Right, sets them aside. Which kind of tells you those sorts of claims aren't exactly new, even back then.
Definitely not. But what's also interesting is that the article mentions a perspective from within the craft circulating at the time.
Okay.
The idea that Freemasonry has always existed for its own sake, and that a man becomes a Mason in order to be a Mason.
Huh. So on one side, you have these wild external accusations.
Yeah.
And on the other, this internal view that it's purely self-referential. That feels, well, a little self-centered maybe.
It certainly could be interpreted that way. And the author of this 1930 article immediately pushes back on that particular idea.
Oh.
While he acknowledges the fraternity doesn't exist for specific external causes like, say, universal education or peace efforts, it's not a single-issue advocacy group.
Right.
He argues very strongly, based on his understanding of the craft's history and ritual, that it is absolutely not entirely self-centered.
Okay, so here's where the article starts to reveal its core argument then. What does the author present as the actual historical object, if not just existing for itself?
The article highlights universal benevolence, that's the term used, as a core historical characteristic belonging to every true Mason.
Universal benevolence.
Yeah, the author sees this not as an optional add-on, but as fundamental to the craft's nature, historically speaking at least.
And the source uses some pretty compelling evidence right from the ritual itself to back this up, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It reminds readers of that question many Masons will instantly recall being asked when seeking membership.
Yeah, question about.
Do you seriously declare that you are prompted to solicit the privilege of Masonry by a sincere wish of being serviceable to your fellow creatures?
Right, I remember that framing.
The article points to this question as direct evidence of the stated historical motivation for joining its tide to a desire to serve others.
That's a powerful piece of the puzzle the article offers, isn't it? The very act of seeking membership, at least historically, according to this author, is framed around outward service. It's not just about what you get from Masonry, but what you intend to do through it.
And the author continues this line of thought. He references a charge given at the close of a lodge,
Okay.
which, after discussing duties owed within the fraternity, explicitly states, these generous principles are to extend farther.
Extend farther.
Every human being has a claim upon your kind offices. Do good unto all. That phrase, extend farther, is crucial in the author's view.
Extend farther. Beyond the lodge walls, you mean, beyond the members themselves.
Exactly. The article uses this to show the principles aren't meant to be confined just inside.
Okay.
It also quotes another passage about discovering the beneficial and happy effects of the craft through liberal benevolence and diffusive charity.
So the source argues you experience the benefits of the institution through the practice of these outward-looking virtues.
That's the connection he makes, yeah. Practice leads to understanding and benefit.
This brings us to the tenets the source describes as central to a Mason's profession. Brotherly love, relief, and truth. The article focuses particularly on the first two, right?
It does.
Yeah.
Let's maybe unpack how the author describes them.
Okay, brotherly love first.
According to this 1930 source, the exercise, the actual doing of brotherly love, is what teaches Masons to regard the whole human species as one family.
The whole human species.
The high and low, the rich and poor, who, as created by one almighty parent, and inhabitants of the same planet are to aid, support, and protect each other.
So it's through putting it into practice.
That's what the author emphasizes, yes.
Hmm.
That's how this universal understanding of humanity as one family arises.
Interesting. And what about relief?
The source describes relief as a duty binding on all people, but particularly on Masons.
Particularly on Masons. Okay.
And its stated aim is quite profound. To soothe the unhappy, to sympathize with their misfortunes, to compassionate their miseries, and to restore peace to their troubled minds.
Now, it might be easy to assume this duty of relief is just for fellow Masons in need. I mean, that's a common thought, maybe.
It is. But does the article address that?
It does, very directly.
Mm-hmm.
The author states this limited view was not the original intention.
Not the original intention. How does he back that up?
To support this, the source brings in a historical voice. Preston's Illustrations of Masonry.
Ah, Preston. A pretty well-known foundational text for Masonic ritual and understanding, right?
Exactly. So the article uses this significant historical source to clarify the point about relief.
And what does Preston say according to the article?
It quotes Preston saying, "The bounds of the greatest nation or the most extensive empire cannot circumscribe the generosity of a liberal mind."
So generosity shouldn't be limited by borders.
All of the human species are, therefore, proper objects for the exercise of charity.
Wow. So that historical reference, cited by the author, powerfully underscores the argument that the intended scope was universal.
Definitely. And the article even notes that Preston's work included a section specifically titled "The Discernment Displayed by Masons in the Choice of Objects of Charity," containing very excellent remarks on the subject of the relief of the poor and needy, which the author uses as further evidence of this broad outward focus in historical Masonic thought.
So if the historical emphasis was on universal benevolence and relief practiced this widely, what does the author argue is the result of this for society at large? Does it have an impact beyond the individual?
Yes, the article argues that from this practice, any candid mind must acknowledge its utility and importance to the state.
Utility and importance to the state. That shifts the perspective, doesn't it? From just internal benefit to external contribution.
Exactly. The author isn't just saying Masons are good people individually. He's saying the institution itself, through its practice of these principles, serves a public good.
How does he conclude that point?
And the source concludes this point by quoting, "It must be no trifling acquisition to any government to have under its jurisdiction a society of men who are not only true patriots and loyal subjects, but the patrons of science and the friends of mankind."
Wow. So that's the author's picture of the historical ideal, a fraternity whose outward actions make it a valuable asset to society and government.
That's the picture painted in the source, yes.
And the source is quite specific that this conception, this understanding of universal benevolence and utility to the state, wasn't just some fringe idea, right?
No, not at all. The article emphasizes that this was the view held by the intellectual leaders of the craft when our ritual was still in a formative state.
So early on in its development.
Yes, and that historical evidence shows this principle actually being put into practice.
This creates a really clear contrast then with that other idea the author mentioned earlier, the one about the craft existing for its own sake.
Absolutely. The source argues that the idea of lodges restricting themselves to purely self-centered objects is of quite recent appearance.
Recent as of 1930, anyway.
Right, recent from that perspective. It's presented as a newer shift, a deviation from that earlier, broader intent.
And the author even points to a specific geographical trend for this newer, more restricted view, if I remember correctly.
He does. He notes that a positive prohibition of external benevolence is to be found only in the United States. And fortunately, not yet in very many of our jurisdictions. So from the author's 1930 perspective, this restriction is a recent localized development, not representative of the craft's historical core purpose.
Okay, so the author makes a strong case for this historical outward-looking purpose. Does the article offer any guidance on how Masons should prioritize these different aspects of duty, to family, to brothers, to the world? Is there an order?
Yes, the source lays out a hierarchy of duty. It derives it from studying the ritual.
Okay.
And it presents it not as a way to limit benevolence, but to order obligations when claims might potentially clash.
Right, practical reality. So what's first?
First, duty is owed to those bound by natural ties, typically family and dependents. Makes sense.
And second.
Second, duty is owed to those bound by the voluntary ties of the fraternity.
Okay, fellow Masons.
Yes, and the source is careful to note this includes those naturally tied to the members, meaning the dependents of fellow Masons also fall under this layer of obligation.
Ah, that's an important clarification. So family, then the Masonic family, including their dependents.
Right, and then finally the outermost circle.
Finally, the obligation extends to all mankind.
To everyone.
Yes. The author is clear that any limitations on helping others are due to external circumstances, practical inability or conflicting claims, not from some philosophical, self-centered view.
So priority comes into play only when you genuinely can't meet two obligations simultaneously. Like being unable to help a brother because of some material obstacle doesn't excuse you from helping a needy neighbor if you can.
Exactly. This layered view reinforces the author's central argument against the self-centered idea, doesn't it? It shows that duty to the broader world is, in this historical understanding, the ultimate extension of Masonic principles.
It does. And the source follows this by issuing a pretty powerful warning about the danger of that very self-centeredness it's arguing against.
Okay, what is that warning?
The author states starkly, no man lives to himself alone, and the same is true of institutions.
Mm-hmm. A familiar idea.
And he describes becoming self-centered, losing that outward focus as the beginning of moral deterioration.
Moral deterioration, that's quite serious language.
Yes, and the author pushes it further, stating that this path ultimately leads to dissolution and death for the institution.
Wow. Dissolution and death. That's the source's most dire prediction for the craft if it loses sight of its outward purpose.
Pretty much. And the article encapsulates this warning with a striking rhetorical question.
Which is,
what shall it profit the craft if it counts its adherents by millions and has unlimited wealth and power if it has forgotten the law of its being?
oof, yeah, that frames the potential cost of focusing only inward as, well, existential, really.
It's a direct challenge to the idea that size or wealth are the main indicators of success if the fundamental purpose is lost.
Absolutely. According to this author, anyway.
So, given this historical perspective and this strong warning, what does the author suggest is the state of things in 1930, and what's the path forward as he sees it? Does he offer a solution?
Well, the source acknowledges a potentially discouraging reality. It observes that the average Mason has never thought much of these things, meaning these historical objects, and the dangers of losing them.
So a lack of awareness, maybe?
Seems so. He even admits that amending this condition seems almost hopeless.
Wow, that sounds a bit pessimistic. Is there any hope offered at all?
There is, but it's a very personal internal one. The author suggests that those who see it had best begin by looking for what needs to be reformed in themselves.
Start with yourself.
Yeah, because, as the article concludes, it is in the praxis of moral and social virtues that we learn.
Ah, back to the practice again.
Exactly. The suggested path forward isn't some grand organizational reform, but individual Masons recommitting to the practice of these virtues, starting with themselves, learning by doing.
Fascinating. So to kind of wrap up our look at this specific source, according to this article from 1930, the objects of Masonry weren't primarily about secrecy or political power, nor were they simply about existing for the benefit of members alone.
Right.
The historical and intended objects, as argued by this author based on ritual and history, were fundamentally rooted in universal benevolence, service to all mankind, and utility to the state.
Very outward-looking perspective.
Which stands in sharp contrast, the article suggests, to both those extreme external claims and that more recent internal idea of the craft existing purely for its own sake.
Yeah, that article offers a specific historical perspective on what the law of being for the craft truly is, or at least what it was understood to be by that author in that era. It's one viewpoint from history.
And it leaves you with a compelling thought to consider, based just on what we've read here. If, as this author writing back in 1930 suggested, becoming self-centered is the beginning of moral deterioration and can lead to dissolution, what does that imply for any institution, or perhaps even for us as individuals, that might drift away from what it views as its founding principles of outward service and broader contribution?
That's certainly something to chew on, isn't it? The potential consequence of losing that outward focus.